There was a man named Jeff. Jeff was a 31-year-old homicide detective in West Babylon, New York. Jeff lived in a medium-sized house with his wife Tina and his 4-year-old son Kyle. Jeff loved his job because he enjoyed the thrill of locking up and catching the people who commit such terrible crimes. Jeff wanted to be a cop ever since he was a kid. Jeff woke up early in the morning to make Tina and Kyle pancakes and bacon. He smiled as he looked at his wife sitting at the dining room table. Then he looked towards his left and gazed at his glorious son Kyle. Jeff then looked out the window to admire the beautiful neighborhood. He squinted because of the sun's luminous shine. Then he looked around at the green leaves and the clear blue sky. Jeff took in a deep breath of fresh air and thought, today is going to be a good day. He smiled. Jeff sat down at the head of the table with the food and passed it to his wife and son. Jeff looked around as he viewed the details of the room. Jeff looked at his son Kyle, and then he stared at the white faded wall next to him, and his eyes stopped and stared at one of the pictures on the wall. He began to envision his past memory. Then he heard someone calling his name again, and he snapped out of it and looked around confused. Then Tina called his name one last time, and Jeff looked at her calmly and asked, "What?" Then Tina said, "Aren't you going to take Kyle to school?" Jeff jolted up and said, "Oh, yeah, right, I almost forgot." Jeff grabbed his favorite white hoodie and quickly put it on, and then he called Kyle and said, "Let's go!" Then Kyle hugged his mom and said, "Bye, Mommy." Jeff got into his blue minivan, and Kyle jumped into the back seat. Jeff started driving down the road to Kyle's school. Jeff looked at him and asked, "Are you ready for school?" Kyle shook his head yes and smiled childishly. Jeff dropped Kyle off at school and drove back home. Jeff arrived back at his house and slowly opened the door. When he walked into his house, he noticed it was quieter than usual. Jeff called Tina's name, and she called back to him, saying, "I'm up here." Jeff looked up at the brightly lit stairway as he slowly walked up. With each step, there was an echoing creak that pierced his ears like knives. Jeff made it to the top of the stairs, and he looked down the hall and stared for a long moment, forgetting what he was coming upstairs for. Then he began to walk, but as he did, the hall appeared to get longer, and it seemed endless. Jeff was so confused and trying to not pay attention to what was going on, but then he panicked and started running as fast as he could to get to the door. He finally made it, and he clutched the doorknob as he panted heavily. He looked behind himself, and the halls were normal. Jeff's head began to hurt, and he opened the door. He walked into the room, and Jeff crawled in the bed next to Tina. Tina turns to him and says, "What's wrong? You look tired, and your heart is beating so violently I can hear it." Jeff ignores the question and turns over. Tina tried to ignore it, although she was worried and annoyed, but Jeff relaxed himself, and he faced the wall and cleared his mind. He began to close his eyes and fall asleep. A few minutes went by, and Jeff woke up as he started to stretch his arms to the sky and yawned loudly. He turned to his side, but Tina wasn't there. Where is she? Jeff thought to himself. Jeff was worried and started to shake. Then he glimpsed at the clock and screamed, "Oh, shit!" It's 12 p.m. and Jeff has overslept. He quickly got out of bed and started to put on his shoes, but then he stopped. He sat back down in the bed and thought, why am I worrying? Tina isn't here because she's out getting Kyle. Jeff sighed in relief and then got up. He started to walk to the bathroom, and he noticed that everything got a little darker. Jeff quietly walked into the bathroom and turned on the sink. He was still kind of half asleep, so he cupped a handful of water and splashed it onto his face. He started to rub his eyes as he stared into the mirror. When he saw his reflection, he jumped back, almost having a heart attack. What he saw was a pale white man with long black greasy hair and a smile carved into his face. The reflection stared back at Jeff, right into his eyes. Jeff finally got a hold of himself and reached to turn on the lights. He flicked the switch, but the lights did not go on. Jeff started to sweat and shake, still staring into the mirror, horrified. Jeff ran out of the door and ran down the old dusty steps. Jeff started pacing back and forth and tried to figure out what the fuck was going on. Jeff unlocked the door and tried opening it, but it just wouldn't open. Jeff started to bang on the door violently. The sound of his body hitting against the solid door echoed throughout the dark, empty house. He gave up and tears started to run down his cheeks as he punched the wall in anger. Jeff then leaned his head against the wall, crying softly as he looked down at his bloody knuckle prints on the wall. Jeff felt so helpless and alone. He was confused and scared. Jeff slowly limped forward towards the window, and he opened the blinds. Jeff's heart almost skipped a beat. Instead of seeing the sunlight or the beautiful scenery, he saw thick wooden boards. Jeff backed up a little and just stared at the wall in shock. Jeff looked around for something to break the boards. He ran into the kitchen and rummaged through everything and found a big kitchen knife. Jeff ran back to the window and started to stab and slash at the boards. He was there for an hour or two slashing. Every few minutes, the knife slipped and cut Jeff's hands, and although it stung like hell, he kept going. Eventually, he got a few boards out, and he was able to see out the window, but the glass was dusty and dirty. It was hard to see through, so Jeff clenched his fist tight and punched through the glass without hesitation. The sound of the glass shattering made Jeff cringe. Jeff looked down in his hands and started to feel so much pain from the glass inside his hand. Jeff ignored it for the moment because he needed to see outside. Jeff poked his head out the window and was appalled. He choked and gagged from the smoke outside. He squinted, his eyes looked around. The skies were no longer a bright blue, but they were a dead, faded gray with big black clouds. Jeff then looked down at the yellow dead grass and the leafless trees. The streets were empty and filled with fog, and the houses were all boarded up. Jeff, confused, terrified, and stressed, all at once fell to the floor and buried his head in his hands and screamed, "What the hell is going on?" Jeff laid back on the cold, hard tiled floor and looked up at the cobweb ceiling. It was quiet. The only thing Jeff could hear was his heartbeat pounding like a drum. Jeff got up onto his hands and knees, and he had this feeling in him take over. He felt so angry and frustrated. Then he looked toward the ground as he grinded his teeth. He stared at the ground intensely and started smashing his face into the ground. His ears were ringing and his head throbbed with pain and his vision was blurry. He could feel a thick, liquidy substance under the palm of his hands. And then he stopped. He looked up as if he had seen or heard something. Then an unfamiliar voice called Jeff's name from the bathroom. Jeff struggled to stand up. He shook and wobbled as he tried to get to the bathroom. Jeff wobbled into the bathroom and he saw this reflection and looked away from disgust. The voice called Jeff's name louder and asked in a soft, tranquil voice, "Why won't you look at me, Jeffrey?" Jeff, scared and still confused, turned around and looked at his reflection. Jeff was staring in horror as he watched his reflection begin to talk. Jeff started to say, No, you're not real. This is just a bad dream." The reflection laughed with a devilish grin. Jeff started in fear and said, "What is so funny?" The reflection laughed quietly to himself, and everything appeared to get darker. The reflection looked at Jeff with his wide, dark eyes and asked, "So, do you want to know what's so funny?" Jeff was afraid to answer, but hesitantly nodded yes. The reflection said, "Come closer. I'll I'll whisper it to you." He laughed again. Jeff slowly walked over to the mirror in fear and fascination. When Jeff got close enough, he nervously clenched the sink and leaned in toward the mirror. The reflection whispered in Jeff's ear, This isn't a nightmare," he giggled childishly. "This is your reality." Jeff backed up and gasped in disbelief. The air almost choked him. Jeff was shivering with fear and he yelled, "You have no proof! This is a dream, and soon I'll wake up to my loving wife and see my son. You're not real." The reflection laughed louder. This time it started to annoy Jeff. His teeth grinded in frustration. The reflection silenced and then said, "You are in denial. Everyone you've known and loved is dead." The reflection started laughing a little bit, but its voice grew deeper. What it said sent a chill down Jeff's spine, but he still refused to believe what he was being told. He looked at the reflection and angrily stood there silently. The reflection laughed and sarcastically said, "Oh boy! Looks like I got Jeffrey angry." The reflection laughed louder and pointed at Jeff. Jeff, now infuriated and pissed off, threw a punch at the mirror and shattered it to pieces.